In the cold, shadowed corners of a bustling city, where the sounds of traffic and the hurried footsteps of pedestrians fill the air, Jack Taylor sat, invisible to the world around him. A once proud soldier, Jack had fought bravely in a war far from home, shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. He had witnessed the horrors of battle, felt the weight of loss, and carried the scars of war, both seen and unseen. Yet, when the war ended, he returned not to a hero's welcome, but to a society that had moved on, indifferent to the sacrifices he and countless others had made. There were no parades, no cheers, only silence. No family waiting, no job to return to, no home to call his own. Instead, Jack was left to wander the streets, a forgotten man, rummaging through garbage cans for scraps, battling the elements, and haunted by memories that wouldn't let him sleep. Every day was a fight for survival, and every night was a struggle against the cold and the ghosts of his past. The loneliness was suffocating, but what hurt the most wasn't the hunger or the cold, it was the feeling of being forgotten. A man who had once been a symbol of bravery was now just another faceless figure, invisible to the very country he had risked his life to protect. In his isolation, Jack clung to the hope that somehow, someone would remember. Someone would acknowledge the men who had given everything for their country. And so, with the last shred of his dignity, he wrote a letter that would soon change his life, and the lives of many others like him, forever. Jack Taylor's story was far from unique. Across the country, countless other veterans wandered the streets, forgotten and abandoned by the very nation they had fought for. Jack's journey was one marked by a crushing silence, a loneliness that no amount of food or shelter could alleviate. After returning from the war, he thought that his sacrifice would be acknowledged, that the country he had given so much to would be there for him when he returned. But the reality was much harsher than he had ever imagined. There were no heroes' welcome parades, no applause, no warm embraces. Instead, he was met with cold stares and indifference, dismissed by a society that moved on without him. The world seemed to forget that Jack was once a soldier, a man who had fought on foreign soil, who had watched his brothers fall beside him, who had given up his youth, his health, and his peace of mind. Instead of recognition and respect, Jack found himself isolated, rejected, and ignored. Every day was a battle for survival. In the beginning, he tried to find work, hoping that someone would see him as the man he once was, the man who had served his country with honor. But the doors were always closed. His hands trembled from the aftereffects of the war, his mind haunted by memories he couldn't escape. The jobs he sought wouldn't have him, no one wanted a middle-aged man with the eyes of someone who had seen too much. So, Jack found himself drifting from one cold street corner to another, looking for food in the trash and trying to find warmth wherever he could. But despite all his struggles, the one thing he could never get used to was the feeling of being invisible. The feeling of being forgotten. He was not seen as a hero, he was seen as a burden. His country had turned its back on him. And that was the hardest thing to bear. With each passing day, Jack's spirit grew weaker. His body was exhausted, his health deteriorating, but his pride was still intact. It wasn't pride in what he had done, it was pride in who he had been. The man who had once worn his uniform with pride, who had stood tall with his brothers in arms, was now a shadow of himself, lost in a world that had forgotten him. That's when he decided to write the letter. Not to ask for pity, not to beg, but to ask a simple question: does America still remember us? It was a question that haunted him, one that echoed in his mind as he huddled against the cold. Jack had nothing left to lose, so he poured his heart into that letter, writing the words that had been eating away at him for years. The letter wasn't about him, it was about all the men and women like him, who had fought, bled, and sacrificed, only to be discarded when they returned home. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it, or if his words would even reach the president, but it was the only thing that made him feel like he still mattered. And so, he mailed it, collapsing onto the cold concrete, unaware that this simple act of reaching out would soon ignite a chain of events that would change his life, and the lives of many others, forever. What happened next was something that Jack Taylor could never have imagined. As he lay there on the freezing streets of the city, his body weak from hunger and exhaustion, his spirit barely clinging to life, he had no idea that his letter was already on its way to the most powerful office in the country. His words, written with trembling hands and filled with the raw pain of a forgotten soldier, had somehow found their way into the hands of Emily Carter, a young White House staffer. Emily's job was often bureaucratic, sorting through piles of mail, filtering out the important letters from the hundreds of requests and correspondences that came in every day. But Emily had a habit of skimming through the letters from ordinary people. She believed that amidst the sea of messages from business moguls, politicians, and celebrities, there were voices that truly mattered, voices that deserved to be heard. That morning, as sunlight streamed through her office window, Emily's gaze fell upon Jack's letter. The handwriting was shaky, the ink pressed deep into the paper as if it had been written by a man on the verge of breaking, but the words carried a weight that struck her to her core. "Dear Mr. Donald Trump," it began, and as Emily read on, her heart clenched with empathy. Jack wasn't asking for money or luxury, he was asking a question that no one had answered. Does America still remember us? The simplicity of the question, the honesty behind it, pierced through the barriers of politics and power. Jack had fought for this country, had given everything for it, and now, he was asking if the country would remember its soldiers when they were no longer useful. Emily knew, in that moment, that this letter could not be ignored. Without a second thought, she grabbed it and rushed through the halls of the White House to the office of the president's senior advisor. This was a letter that needed to be read, not as a piece of paper in a pile, but as the cry for help that it was. At the same time, across the country, in the chaos of the White House's packed schedule, Donald Trump was preparing for meetings with diplomats, discussing policies that affected millions. But when his senior advisor handed him Jack's letter, something stopped him in his tracks. The usual noise of the room, the sound of phones ringing, the rapid tapping of keyboards, faded away as Trump's eyes locked onto the words on the page. He read every line carefully, each sentence sinking deeper into him. Jack Taylor's words were not just a request, they were a mirror reflecting the injustice that many veterans had faced when they returned home. The words were raw, unflinching, and heart-wrenching, describing a man who had fought for his country only to be left to die in its streets. For Trump, this wasn't just another letter, it was a wake-up call. He set the letter down, his face stern, his mind already working on what needed to be done. He lifted his gaze and spoke with calm authority, but there was a fire in his eyes. "Find this man," he ordered. It was a moment that would change the course of Jack's life, and many others, forever. The following days were a blur of frantic action. A special task force was mobilized to track down Jack Taylor, but there was one problem: Jack had no address, no bank account, no records. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. The task force scoured homeless shelters, veteran support centers, and the streets of the city, but they found nothing. On the third day, a call came in from the local police: a homeless man had collapsed near a diner downtown. When the team arrived, they found Jack lying on the pavement, frail and barely conscious. The sight of him, so broken, so forgotten, stirred something deep inside Donald Trump. He had read countless reports, heard stories of veterans living in poverty, but seeing it firsthand, the reality of what had happened to men like Jack, was a wake-up call like no other. Trump didn't hesitate. He gave orders for Jack to be taken to the best hospital in the city, to be treated like a general. And when Jack woke up, he would meet the man who had just changed his fate forever. Jack woke up in a hospital room, disoriented and confused, but there was something different in the air. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the warmth of a blanket felt foreign to him. He hadn't experienced comfort like this in years. A nurse stood by his bedside, monitoring his recovery. He tried to sit up, but dizziness forced him back down. He didn't understand how he had gotten here, but before he could ask, the door opened, and in stepped none other than Donald Trump. Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. The man who had once been just a figure on a screen, who had led the country, was sitting right there beside him. Jack's voice trembled as he spoke, unsure if he was still dreaming. But Trump was calm, steady, and without any political pretense. "I read your letter," he said. Those words were the first words of validation Jack had heard in years. Trump's voice was firm, but there was no judgment in it, only a deep understanding of the injustice Jack had endured. As Jack told Trump about his struggles, the battles he had fought in war, the struggles he had faced to survive, and how his Medal of Honor had been stolen, Trump's expression darkened. It wasn't just pity in his eyes, it was a righteous anger. Trump promised Jack that he wouldn't just be a victim of the system anymore. He would be treated with the respect and dignity he deserved, and he wouldn't go back to the streets. For the first time in years, Jack felt a spark of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, his country still remembered him. And in that moment, everything began to change. Ban de noi. Viet y for ton don van die 702 he va can suk loi quan nuoi ne theo van hoamai, Viet bang tiang on. ChatGPT de noi. The story of Jack Taylor and his journey through the streets of America took a turn that no one could have predicted. After years of suffering in silence, battling loneliness, hunger, and cold, Jack found himself at a crossroads in his life. The letter he had written, asking simply whether America still remembered its veterans, had reached the desk of the most powerful man in the country. Donald Trump, upon reading Jack's words, knew that something had to be done, and the wheels of change began to turn. Within hours, a special task force had been mobilized, scouring the city for Jack. They went through homeless shelters, veteran support centers, and even the dark alleys where Jack had spent his nights. The streets seemed endless, and Jack appeared to be a ghost lost to time. Yet, fate had other plans. On the third day, the call came in. Local police had found an elderly homeless man collapsed near a diner. When they arrived, they found Jack, frail and barely conscious, his last possession a crumpled piece of paper, the letter he had written to Donald Trump. Jack was rushed to the best hospital in the city, as Trump had personally ordered. It wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a statement that America would no longer forget the men who had given everything for it. The cold streets, the unfeeling society, the years of being invisible, it was all coming to an end. Trump's decision to intervene in Jack's life marked the beginning of something much larger, a movement that would ripple across the country, affecting thousands of forgotten veterans. But for Jack, it was personal. When Jack woke up in the hospital, he was disoriented. For a man who had spent years on the streets, this sterile, warm environment felt like a dream. The last time he had experienced such comfort, it felt like a lifetime ago. His mind, clouded by exhaustion and pain, struggled to make sense of it all. As he tried to sit up, a nurse was at his side, monitoring his recovery. She smiled gently and reassured him that he was in good hands. He looked around, confused, until the door opened. And then, in walked Donald Trump. It wasn't the politician or the president that walked in, but a man with a deep, calm resolve. Trump's presence was commanding, but it was different from the grandeur of the political stage. There were no cameras, no press. There was just a man sitting beside another, eye to eye. Trump had read Jack's letter, and now, in the silence of that hospital room, he was here to make things right. Jack, still unsure if he was dreaming or awake, could hardly find the words. But Trump was steady, his gaze unflinching. "I read your letter," he said, his voice firm but not cold. It was the first validation Jack had received in years. The man who had been a soldier, who had sacrificed so much, now had someone who saw him for who he truly was. Jack's story poured out, the weight of it heavy in the room. He spoke of the battles, the friends lost, the trauma that followed him home. He told Trump about the stolen medal, his only tangible link to the honor he had fought for. The man who had promised Jack so much, had taken so much from him in return. Frank Dawson, the man who had scammed Jack, had stolen more than a medal, he had stolen a piece of Jack's dignity. But Trump's eyes narrowed when Jack mentioned Dawson's name. The president's jaw tightened. There was no pity in his eyes, just a deep, simmering rage at the injustice. "I won't let a man like that walk free," Trump said, his voice low and full of resolve. And then, with one phone call, Trump set into motion something that would change the entire landscape of veteran support in America. Jack's struggle wasn't just his own, it was a reflection of a much larger systemic failure. But with the full weight of Trump's power behind him, Jack's life was about to change forever. No longer would he be a forgotten soldier, discarded and invisible. Jack would be treated with the respect he deserved. He was no longer just a homeless man on the streets. He was Jack Taylor, a veteran of this country, and that meant something. When Jack left the hospital, the world outside felt different. He had a place now. A home. The car that picked him up wasn't taking him back to the streets. It was taking him to a small, but warm apartment, his new home. For the first time in years, Jack had a roof over his head, food in his stomach, and a bed to sleep in. But this wasn't just about Jack. This was a turning point for veterans across the country. Trump's initiative to expand veteran support services, to provide housing, medical care, and job opportunities for those who had given everything for the nation, was already in motion. Jack's story was no longer just his own, it was a symbol of change. Jack wasn't just a beneficiary of this new program, he became a symbol of what could be. He became the face of a movement that would give veterans their dignity back. No longer would they be forgotten. No longer would they be ignored. They had given their lives to protect the nation, and now the nation would stand up and protect them in return. And as Jack sat in his new home, he knew that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he believed that change was possible, and it had all started with a letter, a simple question that had awakened the country to the plight of its veterans. Jack Taylor's life had taken him down an unexpected path, one he never imagined when he first enlisted in the military. As a young man, he had proudly worn his uniform, standing side by side with his brothers in arms, ready to lay down his life for his country. The battles he fought were more than just physical confrontations, they were the very test of survival, of courage, and of what it meant to be a part of something larger than oneself. Jack had faced horrors that no one should ever have to witness, and the loss of friends, the constant terror, and the unrelenting weight of war left deep scars on him. Yet, despite all of that, when he returned home, he believed he would be met with a hero's welcome, a parade, a thank you, a return to normalcy. He never imagined the cruel truth that awaited him. Instead of a warm welcome, Jack was greeted with cold stares. The country he had fought for had no place for him when he came back. There was no home to return to, no family waiting for him, and no job waiting to offer him stability. The streets, which had once felt like a battlefield, now became his home. Jack wandered through the cold, unforgiving streets of his city, trying to survive, trying to find meaning in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. He searched through trash bins, hoping to find something to eat, but even his basic needs went unmet. Worse still, he felt invisible to the very society he had risked his life for. He became just another nameless, faceless figure, forgotten, ignored, and discarded by the nation that had once claimed him as a hero. It wasn't just the hunger or the cold that haunted Jack, it was the deep sense of abandonment. He had fought in a war that had cost him his youth, his friends, and his peace of mind, and yet when he returned, there was no place for him. No recognition, no comfort, no care. He found himself slipping deeper into despair, struggling to keep his head above water, each day feeling like a battle he wasn't sure he could win. He tried seeking help from veteran support programs, but the assistance was sparse, barely enough to cover his most basic needs. He was told to hold on, that things would get better, but they never did. At his lowest, when Jack had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the memories of the battles he had fought, he decided to write a letter. It wasn't a plea for money or luxury, it was a cry for recognition. A question that had been plaguing his mind for years: does America still remember us? Jack wrote with trembling hands, pouring every ounce of his frustration, pain, and hope into the letter. It wasn't a letter asking for charity or sympathy, it was a letter asking for acknowledgement. Jack wanted to know if the country he had fought for, the country he had sacrificed everything for, still cared about men like him. His letter wasn't just words, it was the final shred of hope he had left. He mailed it without knowing if it would ever be seen by anyone who cared. He had nothing left to lose. What Jack didn't know, however, was that his letter would soon spark a series of events that would change not only his life but the lives of thousands of other forgotten veterans. The letter, lost among the thousands of others that arrived at the White House every day, found its way into the hands of Emily Carter, a young staffer working at the White House. Emily was tasked with sorting through the president's mail, often dealing with endless requests from politicians, businessmen, and high-profile figures. But Emily, with her deep sense of empathy, would often skim through the letters from ordinary people. And that morning, her eyes landed on Jack's letter. The words struck her in a way that none of the others had. She read the letter, over and over, feeling the weight of Jack's pain, his loneliness, his hopelessness. It was raw, honest, and heartbreaking. Emily knew, deep in her gut, that this letter couldn't be ignored. Without hesitation, she grabbed it and rushed down the halls of the White House to bring it to the president. This letter was different. It mattered. When Donald Trump read Jack's letter, he was deeply moved. As the President of the United States, he had read countless reports and seen the struggles that veterans faced, but something about Jack's words hit him hard. This wasn't just another letter, it was a stark reminder of the suffering of the men and women who had given everything for their country, only to be discarded when they returned home. Trump understood the gravity of the situation. He didn't need to think twice about it. He gave the command to find Jack Taylor, to track him down, and to ensure that he, and others like him, received the help they so desperately needed. Trump didn't just want to help Jack, he wanted to do something that would change the system for good, to ensure that veterans would no longer be forgotten, no longer be cast aside like Jack had been. Within days, a special task force was assembled to find Jack. They scoured homeless shelters, veteran support centers, and even the streets where Jack had once wandered. But it wasn't easy. Jack had no address, no records, no way of being found. It seemed like he had vanished into the world. But then, on the third day, a call came in. Jack had collapsed on the street, barely alive, his body ravaged by years of neglect and hardship. When the task force arrived, they found Jack clinging to life, a crumpled piece of paper, the letter, still clutched in his hand. He was rushed to the best hospital in the city, and for the first time in years, Jack received the care he so desperately needed. What happened next would change Jack's life forever. When Jack awoke, he was disoriented, confused, and unsure of where he was. But when the door to his hospital room opened, and Donald Trump walked in, Jack couldn't believe his eyes. The President of the United States was standing right there in front of him, acknowledging him as a human being, as a man who had once given everything for his country. Trump didn't offer pity or empty words, he offered action. He told Jack that he would no longer be forgotten, that the system would change, and that he would help Jack get back on his feet. This was not just about helping one man, it was about giving back the dignity to every veteran who had been left behind. And in that moment, Jack Taylor felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Hope that his life, and the lives of thousands of others like him, could be restored. Trump's decision to step in and help Jack wasn't just an act of charity, it was a message to the entire nation. It was a declaration that no veteran would be forgotten again. And for Jack, it was the beginning of a new chapter. With the help of Trump's initiative to expand veteran support programs across the country, Jack was given a permanent home, medical care, and the chance to rebuild his life. What started as a letter from a broken man asking, "Does America still remember us?" had turned into a movement that would ensure no veteran would ever again feel invisible. The aftermath of Jack Taylor's unexpected rise from despair to hope was nothing short of a revolution for his life, and for the lives of countless other veterans across America. For Jack, The man who had once been lost in the shadows of the streets, forgotten by his country and discarded by society, everything had shifted with one letter, one small act of writing his story. But what came next wasn't just a rescue from homelessness, it was the beginning of a broader movement that would bring veterans from the margins of society back into the fold, with dignity, respect, and care that they had long been denied. When Jack first stepped into his new home, he could hardly believe what he saw. After years of battling the elements, scrambling for food, and seeking solace in the shadows of alleyways, the small, modest apartment before him felt like a mansion. There was a soft bed waiting for him, clean clothes in the closet, a hot meal in the fridge, and a place to simply exist without the fear of being pushed aside. He had walked through so many empty streets, each one filled with the echoes of his past, the war, the hunger, the loneliness. But now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jack had a place to call his own. The stark contrast between the freezing cold streets he had known for so long and the warmth of his new apartment was enough to make him tremble. But there was something deeper stirring within him, a spark of pride, of worth, of a life restored. But it wasn't just about the physical home. It was about the emotional and psychological healing that was beginning to unfold. Jack's experiences, his suffering, had always been wrapped in silence. He had been taught to carry the weight of war on his own shoulders, to bury the memories, to ignore the pain, and to continue trudging forward without complaint. His struggles had never been acknowledged by those who had benefited from the very freedoms he had fought to protect. And so, he had learned to hide his pain, to believe that his life, his sacrifices, didn't matter. He had tried to survive, but had done so as a shadow, an invisible man in a world that had forgotten the price of its safety. Yet, as soon as Jack woke up in that hospital room, surrounded by the comfort and care of people who saw him, something profound began to shift. His story, once buried under layers of despair and neglect, was being heard. Not only by the people who cared for him in that moment but by the President of the United States himself. Donald Trump had made Jack's life, his story, a priority. In doing so, Trump had sent a powerful message, not just to Jack, but to every veteran in the country. The message was simple, yet profound: you are not forgotten. And that message, Jack realized, would be the catalyst for something larger. With the power and influence that Trump's office could bring, Jack's story wasn't just about one man's recovery, it was a symbol. It was the face of countless men and women who had served this country, given their all, and then found themselves discarded in the cold. These forgotten heroes, these silent sufferers, were now being recognized, no longer left to die on the streets, no longer relegated to the shadows of society. The systemic failure to support veterans was being exposed, and change was beginning. Trump's initiative to expand veteran support programs was not just a political move, it was a direct response to the lived experiences of those like Jack. It wasn't about offering temporary charity, it was about creating long-term solutions. Through comprehensive medical care, housing programs, job placement services, and mental health support, the initiative aimed to give veterans a new lease on life. The approach was simple: veterans are human beings who deserve the same opportunities and care as anyone else. For Jack, this wasn't just a program, it was a promise that no veteran would be left behind again. For once, the government wasn't just paying lip service to its heroes, it was taking action. As Jack became a symbol of this new wave of change, he took it upon himself to ensure that the voices of veterans who were still suffering were heard. He became a beacon of hope, not only for those who had lost everything but for the ones who didn't know how to ask for help. With his own life on the mend, Jack was determined to give back, to help the very people who had stood beside him in the battlefields of war, and who now fought the same battles of poverty, addiction, and mental health. Every veteran Jack met was another reminder of the scars that were left behind, not just on the body, but on the soul. And so, Jack's story continued, but it was no longer just his own. It had become a part of a larger national movement to ensure that veterans had access to the resources they needed to thrive. No longer were they just stories in the news, fleeting moments of concern before being forgotten again. They were being heard, they were being helped, and they were being seen. And as Jack worked tirelessly alongside other veterans to raise awareness, to demand better conditions and better treatment, something remarkable began to happen. The country, as a whole, started to shift its perspective. The once dismissed veterans, once relegated to the fringes of society, were now standing tall, demanding the respect and care they had earned. But the most profound change wasn't in the policy or the programs, it was in the hearts and minds of people across the country. Jack's journey had sparked a nationwide reckoning with the treatment of veterans. People who had once turned a blind eye began to take action. Communities rallied around their local veterans, offering support and services. Veterans themselves, once silent in their suffering, began to speak out, sharing their stories and advocating for the change they so desperately needed. For Jack, the healing process was far from over. It would take time, patience, and continued support. But for the first time in his life, he could see a future. And that future wasn't just about surviving, it was about living with dignity, with purpose, and with the recognition he had always deserved. Jack was no longer invisible. He had become part of something much larger than himself, a symbol of resilience, hope, and the power of change. And as he stood in front of a crowd of veterans, sharing his story, he knew that his fight, our fight, was far from over. But now, for the first time, they weren't fighting alone. And that made all the difference. The change in Jack Taylor's life, marked by the unexpected turn of events that followed his letter to the president, wasn't just a personal victory. It was the spark of a much larger fire, a fire that would ignite a nationwide movement to give veterans the respect, care, and opportunities they had long been denied. For Jack, a man who had spent too many years forgotten, his life was about to take a turn, not only because of the actions of a powerful man, but because of the resilience within himself to continue fighting, for himself, for his fellow veterans, and for every American who had ever been overlooked or cast aside. When Jack stepped into his new home, it felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. The apartment wasn't grand, but for Jack, it was everything he had ever wanted, a place to call his own. The air inside smelled fresh, warm, and inviting. His bed, for the first time in years, felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could finally rest without fear of being moved along or chased away. He had wandered the streets of New York for so long that the idea of owning something, anything, seemed like an impossibility. But there it was, a door that Jack could finally close behind him and know that it was his, that he was safe. The comfort of a warm bed, food in the refrigerator, and a sense of peace was a physical manifestation of what Jack had been yearning for all these years, the recognition that he mattered. No longer would he be just another forgotten soul wandering through the streets. The country that he had once given everything to, that had left him behind in his darkest hours, had now offered him a second chance. But as he lay in his bed that night, Jack realized that this moment, this new chapter, wasn't just about comfort, it was about reclaiming his dignity. The emotional scars that war had left on Jack were far deeper than any physical wounds. Years of being ignored, overlooked, and tossed aside had taken a toll on his spirit. For a long time, he had convinced himself that he was nothing more than the shadow of the man he had once been. But now, with the president's intervention and the help of a nationwide veteran support program, Jack felt like something inside of him was starting to heal. He no longer had to hide his pain, nor did he have to endure his struggles alone. The emotional weight of everything he had gone through, everything he had been forced to suppress, started to lift. Jack's transformation didn't stop with his new home. For the first time in years, he began to feel hopeful about the future. That hope wasn't just rooted in the physical comforts he now had, but in the knowledge that there were people who cared about him, who saw him, not as a burden, but as a man who had given everything for his country. The changes that Trump had set into motion weren't just about restoring the material things that veterans like Jack had lost. It was about restoring a sense of humanity, of purpose, of recognition. Trump's decision to launch a nationwide veteran support program had far-reaching implications, and Jack became a living testament to its success. He was not just a recipient of aid, but a symbol, a beacon of the change that was sweeping through the nation. The program provided not only housing, medical care but also job placement assistance, mental health services, and reintegration programs to help veterans return to civilian life with dignity. For so many veterans, these programs were a lifeline, a tangible reminder that they were not forgotten, that they still mattered. For Jack, this new support system was a chance to rebuild, not just his life, but his sense of identity. As he navigated his way through this new phase, he realized that he wasn't alone. He connected with other veterans who, like him, had felt forgotten, abandoned, and invisible. Jack spent countless hours talking to them, listening to their stories, and offering advice when he could. He was able to relate to them in a way that no one else could. He had been where they were. He had fought those same demons, those same feelings of isolation, and now he was able to help them see that there was still hope. But Jack didn't stop there. He didn't just want to be a beneficiary of the system, he wanted to be an active part of the solution. He started speaking out, advocating for better treatment for veterans, better mental health support, and more effective programs to help them reintegrate into society. Jack knew that his story wasn't just his own, it was the story of thousands of men and women who had served their country and returned to a society that didn't understand the depth of their sacrifices. Jack used his newfound voice to raise awareness, to shine a light on the issues that so many veterans faced, and to ensure that the changes Trump had started would continue. As Jack traveled across the country to speak at rallies, community meetings, and veteran conferences, his message became clear: no veteran should ever feel forgotten. He shared his own story, but more importantly, he listened to the stories of others. He spoke with passion and conviction, not only about the hardships veterans face but about the need for lasting change. He understood that it wasn't enough to offer temporary help or quick fixes, the system needed to be overhauled to ensure that veterans had access to the resources they needed to thrive, not just survive. The support Jack received was only the beginning. Trump's initiative led to a nationwide push for comprehensive reform in the way veterans were treated. With the help of lawmakers, advocacy groups, and grassroots organizations, the movement to support veterans gained momentum. What had once been an issue that few people paid attention to had now become a central topic in political debates and national discussions. Veterans, for the first time in decades, were being given the attention and respect they deserved. Jack's life was forever changed, but the true power of his story lay in its ripple effect. The change that started with Jack Taylor's letter to Donald Trump wasn't just about one man's transformation, it was about the transformation of an entire nation. It was about recognizing the sacrifices made by so many men and women, and making sure they were treated with the dignity and respect they had earned. Jack Taylor's life was a testament to the power of hope, of action, and of the belief that no one, no matter how broken or forgotten they may feel, should ever be left behind. As the years went by, Jack continued to work with veterans, to speak out for their rights, and to inspire others to do the same. His journey from the streets to the White House was one of pain, resilience, and ultimately, redemption. And through it all, Jack learned something profound, that while his story was unique, the struggles he faced were shared by so many others. His transformation was a symbol of the power of change, and a reminder that when a nation comes together to care for its heroes, it not only changes their lives, it changes the future of the entire country. The story of Jack Taylor teaches us a profound lesson about the power of empathy, action, and collective responsibility. In a culture that often values individual success and overlooks the struggles of others, Jack's journey reminds us that every person, no matter their past or circumstances, deserves dignity, care, and respect. His story highlights the importance of recognizing the sacrifices of those who serve our country, and how easy it is for them to be forgotten once they return home. But it also shows that change is possible when individuals and leaders come together to take action. Jack's transformation, sparked by one letter, is a testament to how a small act of reaching out, advocating for others, and offering support can create ripples of change that affect entire communities. In the real world, this lesson calls on us to look beyond our own lives and take an active role in lifting others up, whether it's veterans, the homeless, or anyone who feels invisible. As a society, we have a responsibility to ensure that no one is left behind, and that everyone has the opportunity to reclaim their dignity and live a life of purpose.